Why do Arabs always lose wars against the West? It's an interesting question, but is it a fair one? Do Arab and Islamic countries routinely lose wars against Western powers? The answer? Absolutely. Today we can look at Iran versus Israel. Iran has 90 million people, almost 10 times more than Israel, and Iran's active army is over 3 times larger, not including its proxies. Yet they haven't been that impressive. Hundreds of missiles do minimal damage. Their allies only escape death by hiding in tunnels, and even then, not successfully. Their dying leaders throw sticks at high-tech Israeli drones and lose their hands to Israeli-made pagers. Arab nations have failed at defeating Israel since the day it became a nation. They've also fallen to the Americans, the British, and the French. In fact, the last time an Arab army won a decisive war against the West was the Battle of Hattin, when Saladin defeated the Christian Crusaders and conquered Jerusalem. That was in 1187 AD. So what's going on? Hey, I'm Ken LaCourte. I do my best to research elephants in rooms and give you straightforward, sometimes unpopular answers. Here, I dug into the cultural issues that make it hard to win wars. And while I'm not really focusing on economics, those issues certainly affect economies and industrialization as well. I mean, you've probably never seen a car made in an Arab country, or a plane, or a computer, or really anything much besides food and clothing. The harsh truth is that the region is a bit of an industrial wasteland for many of the same reasons that caused their military failures. We'll look at fundamental issues such as trust and loyalty in fragmented societies, their tendency towards centralization and rigid hierarchy, some broader cultural issues, and finally a look at how Islam itself may affect it all. It's even more interesting when we look at history, because it's tempting to look at the Mideast and think that they've always been a bit backwards in so many ways. And that's just dead wrong. The Islamic Golden Age of the 8th century to the 13th century was a powerhouse of scientific and military might. While Europe stumbled through the Dark Ages, the Arab world was rocking. Muslim doctors were performing advanced surgeries like removing cataracts and treating kidney stones, while Europeans were still using leeches. And their military was powerful too. They conquered lands from Spain to India, built the world's largest empire, and held it for centuries. But empires rise and fall. The Arab world's decline began around the 13th century. Mongol invasions didn't help. The Black Death wiped out big chunks of the population, and political fragmentation weakened once powerful countries. Meanwhile, Europe and the West emerged with the Renaissance and later the Industrial Revolution. And by the 1800s, the tables had turned. Western powers carved up the Middle East, drawing borders that are still causing conflicts today. Now, the region barely contributes at all to the scientific world. They're consumers, not creators. Some countries sit on oil, and most that don't have much of an economy. But the richer ones have some of the world's largest military budgets. So it's more than about money or intelligence. It's about culture, politics, and societal structures that don't work like they should. But before we jump in, it's good to be cautious about cultural comparisons. It's easy to be like, we're great, they're not. And history is littered with leaders who screwed up by misreading other cultures. Hitler thought America was a mongrel country that'd be a pushover. The United States didn't understand the resilience of the Vietnamese or Afghans and got bogged down in endless wars. Putin figured Ukraine was a joke run by drug addicts and then got stuck in a meat grinder. So we need to be careful, but we also can't ignore reality. Now, Arab countries do pretty well with insurgencies and guerrilla warfare. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, called it winning wars without battles. But when it comes to battles and full warfare, they have problems. And the first part of their culture to look at is trust and loyalty. Who are Arabs loyal to? Who are their soldiers really loyal to? Trust and loyalty issues plague Arab armies, hurting their effectiveness from top to bottom. It's a problem that starts with rulers who are afraid of their own military, and it trickles all the way down to soldiers not trusting their officers. For Americans or people in most of the world, their primary loyalty to their country is a given, but it's more complicated in the Mideast. For many, tribal and religious loyalties come first. They're bonds based on shared ancestry, traditions, and support systems that have existed for centuries. Those ties can be much stronger than national identities, which are relatively new in some Arab countries. This often starts at the very top. Rulers stack key military positions with members of their own sect or tribe. In Syria, the Alawite minority controls the military. In Jordan, it's the East Bankers. In Iraq under Saddam, it was the Sunnis. And that tribalism and family ties can lead to the exact opposite of a meritocracy, putting less competent people in critical positions. Because authoritarian leaders fear their armies as much as they rely on them. They know military coups are a real threat. It's how many of them came to power. So they use divide and conquer strategies, create competing units and agencies to keep everyone off balance a little bit. Those strategies wreak havoc on efficiency. And paranoia leads to some bizarre practices. In many Arab countries, basic military information, stuff the United States publishes routinely, it's treated like top secrets. Unit designations, names of commanders, even routine promotions and transfers are classified. It's not just about keeping secrets from the enemies, it's about keeping secrets from each other, so that different parts of the military stay in the dark. That culture of mistrust extends beyond their borders, and Arab armies rarely train together or share information. And it trickles right down to the unit level. I mean, if infantry doesn't trust that the artillery will give covering fire, they're not going to advance. This also encourages information hoarding, where knowledge is power. And in Arab military culture, you don't share power. Technicians treat their expertise like a closely guarded secrets. It ensures they keep their job, but it also creates information silos where cross-training rarely happens. Units might know their specific jobs, but they can't fill in for each other if someone's hit. It creates a fragile system with no depth. One foreign military trainer told a story of carefully creating Arabic manuals for tanks, only to have the officers immediately confiscate them, pretending that the soldiers couldn't read. But that wasn't it. They just didn't want soldiers to have independent sources of knowledge. Those issues help create an over-reliance on centralization and hierarchy as well that defines Arab militaries. Orders come from the top with minimal flexibility. Junior officers don't make decisions, they follow orders. This creates a bizarre situation where a sergeant in the US military often has more real authority than an Arab colonel. Minor decisions get kicked all the way up to the top brass, slowing things to a halt. The class divide between officers and enlisted men is serious, and Arab officers routinely treat their own soldiers like crap. After Iraq's defeat in 1991, prisoners of war showed shocking levels of hatred towards their own officers. A divide between officers and grunts exists in every army, but Western militaries fill that with NCOs, non-commissioned officers, who've risen up through the ranks of the enlisted men. They come from the barracks, not the academy, and they're key trainers to bridge the gap between officers and enlisted men. It's an important link missing in Arab armies, but the issues go far beyond military org charts. Broader issues affect the military as well, like the education system. In most Arab countries, schools prioritize rote memorization instead of critical thinking. Students spend years cramming facts into their heads, then regurgitating them on exams. Questioning the teacher, exploring alternative solutions, that's just not popular. That same attitude comes into the military as well, where conformity rules. Innovation, initiative, no. As one military observer put it, the nail that stands up gets hammered down. Officers focus on being seen as industrious, loyal, and compliant. Rocking the boat is a career killer. This aversion to standing out has serious consequences. In training exercises, junior officers will sometimes deliberately underperform to avoid outshining their bosses. Mistakes are covered up rather than used as learning opportunities. When things go wrong, the default response is to blame equipment, outsiders, or even pretend it didn't happen. Anything but acknowledging a potential failure. It ties into the high value Arab cultures place on saving face and maintaining honor. I learned this firsthand in Gaza years back, when some of my colleagues were kidnapped and I was sent in to help. We had a number of local guards protecting me and one other colleague, and I went on a security tour of our small hotel. We came to one spot where it was super easy for someone to sneak in, and I was told that there was always a guard stationed there. But there wasn't a guard. And it was a bizarre conversation. I was trying to make sure it wouldn't be left unguarded again, and they pretended it hadn't happened at all because they weren't accustomed to admitting a problem out loud. In warfare, that's a recipe for disaster. Progress comes from failure, critiques, and then problem solving. Changing this isn't just about military reforms, though. It would take a fundamental shift in the wider social and religious culture, and that's a tall order. I've left talking about religion until the end because it's complicated, maybe too complicated to really untangle from a culture. I mean, Islam is really the defining feature of these countries I'm talking about, and it's fully integrated into their culture and their daily lives. Now, does that come from the text of the Quran, or does the culture determine how it reacts to the faith? I find it best to visualize religion and culture as threads in an intertwined rope. After 1,400 years of coexistence, it's impossible to really separate them. Even the concept of fatalism is thought to be enmeshed in Islam. The phrase, inshallah, if God wills it, that can breed a sense of resignation, a why bother attitude that's the opposite of taking charge and getting things done. But it's also used by non-religious Arabs, and it really predates Islam. I was in Iraq for a bit during the Second Gulf War, and I talked to a young American soldier who was training Iraqis to take over. He said that time and time again, their soldiers would literally hold their rifles above their head to shoot. Their belief was that God would guide those bullets, so it really didn't matter if they aimed their guns at all. That's not great soldiering. The last point about religion is to look at the more westernized concept of separating church and state. Along with systems of checks and balances within governments, it helps create an environment where different institutions can challenge each other, and where regular people can challenge those in charge. That's how social progress happens. But when a single authority controls both religious and political power, it can be difficult, sometimes impossible, to challenge those norms and the powers that run the place. That stagnates growth, and it stagnates the improvement of a civilization. And as we've seen time after time, civilizations that have their acts together are a lot more likely to win wars. That came into play in World War II, where on so many levels, Germany was an industrious, advanced society, but it also had fatal flaws. To understand how both of those could be true, I read a fascinating book called Ordinary Men, which looked at one battalion of regular guys who were transformed into the worst mass murderers you could imagine. I turned it into this video that raises the question, would you and I have become good Nazis? It's pretty interesting. Hey, thanks for joining me. I'm active in the comments below, so chat with me there and check out some of my other videos if you like this one. And come back again.